The version of Star Wars sitting on your telly right now is not the version anyone watched in 1977. It has been trimmed, added to, recoloured, rescored and quietly rearranged for nearly 50 years. And it is still being fiddled with. Most films get finished once. This one never really did. So tonight we're going through the bits that fell out. The scenes cut for pacing, the scenes cut because the monster suits looked like enormous teddy bears, and one scene cut because Jabba the Hutt was played by a bloke in a fur coat and nobody could afford to turn him into a slug. And then later on, the theories, the ones people built in the gaps, some of them charming, some of them a bit grim, one of them written by an actual astrophysicist with actual maths in it. If you fancy more of this sort of thing, subscribing helps me out a lot. I should warn you now that I have a soft spot for the deleted Tatooine material, and I will almost certainly be insufferable about it in about 4 minutes. Let's start there anyway. In the first Star Wars film, there's a character called Biggs Darklighter. If the name means nothing to you, that's completely reasonable. In the film, as released, he turns up near the end, in a flight suit, on Yavin, greets Luke like they go way back, flies in the trench, and gets shot down. That's it. That's his entire part. A generation of viewers watched him die and had no idea who he was supposed to be. He was supposed to be quite a lot. The original opening of the film, as shot, spends a good while on Tatooine before Luke ever finds the droids. It starts with him on the moisture farm, working, when he catches something odd going on overhead. He grabs his macro binoculars and watches 2 ships tangling in orbit. That's the Tantive 4 being boarded. The battle that opens the film, seen from the ground by a farm boy who has no idea what he's looking at. I love that shot. It's such a simple, elegant piece of scale, and it's gone. Then he gets in his land speeder and belts into town, Anchorhead. On the way in, he nearly flattens an old woman, which was an effect shot that never got finished. And the fact that the very first thing we'd have learned about Luke Skywalker is that he's a menace behind the wheel would have set up an awful lot about the next 6 hours of cinema. He arrives at Tosha Station. And here is where the whole thing turns. Tosha Station is where the local kids hang about. Cammy, Fixer, Deke, Windy. Luke comes flying in, absolutely buzzing, trying to tell them all about the space battle he's just watched. They could not care less. They tell him to pipe down. They call him Wormy. Wormy. I think about that nickname a lot. In the film we actually got, Luke reads as a slightly whiny but fundamentally decent lad who's a bit bored and clearly destined for something. When his aunt and uncle are killed, he steps straight into being a rebel. And it plays as noble because we've been given no reason to think otherwise. In the version that got cut, he's the annoying younger one who tags along. The one his mates find a bit much. The one who gets a nickname he obviously hates and can't do anything about. That's a different lad entirely. That's a lad who wants out, which is where Biggs comes in. Biggs is there at the station, home on leave, in an Imperial Academy uniform. He's done it. He's the one who got off the planet. And Luke is thrilled about the uniform, which is the detail that gets me, because Luke is not being political here at all. He isn't impressed that his friend is serving the Empire, and he isn't horrified by it either. He's impressed that his friend left. Then the two of them go outside, and Biggs tells him quietly that he's going to jump ship. He's joining the rebellion. He says it plainly, the way you tell a mate you are emigrating. And Luke can't go with him because he's promised his uncle another season on the farm. Garrick Hagan, who played Biggs, described the scene years later in an interview with Empire, and the word he reached for was poignance. He's right. It is not an action beat, and it is not exposition. It is 2 young men saying goodbye in a car park, and one of them knows he's being left behind. So why cut it? Pacing mostly. You have a film that opens with a Star Destroyer swallowing a smaller ship, then a masked man striding through the smoke, and then you'd cut away to 20-odd minutes of a teenager being teased at a petrol station. Lucas took the view that the film needed to get moving, and that we didn't need the setup. He is not obviously wrong about that. The film he released is a very tight film. But the trade is real. What you lose is the reason Luke goes. Here's a fun detail about the afterlife of that sequence. Because it never fully died. It's in the novelization. It's in the old comic adaptations. It has been half canon in the fandom for decades on the strength of that alone. And Lucasfilm has quietly treated it as real for years. When Star Wars Rebels was in development, one of their episodes was going to be about Biggs defecting from the Empire, and they changed it. Swapped him out for Wedge and Hobby, specifically because the deleted Tosha Station conversation establishes that Biggs joins the rebellion only shortly before the Battle of Yavin. They rewrote an episode of television to avoid contradicting a scene that isn't in the film. That tells you how they think about it. And then the Book of Boba Fett went and put Kami and Fixer back on screen at Tosche Station. Decades on, still in the same place, still doing the same nothing, which is a lovely, faintly sad little joke at their expense. And it also means the location is officially a real place, with real people in it now. One more cut from that same batch hurts a bit more, and it's the Yavin side of the story. The reunion between Luke and Biggs before the trench run was originally longer. Luke introduces him to the others. Biggs vouches for him. There's a whole exchange about the pair of them flying together at last. Some of that got restored in the 1997 re-release, and it does help. Not enough to fully fix it, but it helps. Because in the theatrical cut, when Luke screams Biggs' name as the man's fighter comes apart, most people in the cinema were hearing that name for roughly the second time. They also shot Luke shouting for him over the radio afterwards, which didn't make it in either. Probably for the best. That would have been a lot. The rest of the Tatooine off-cuts are smaller, and I'll rattle through them, because a few are quite sweet. There's a shot of Aunt Beru pouring the blue milk before she brings dinner over, which exists purely to establish that these people have a routine and a kitchen and an ordinary evening. There's a longer version of Red Leader talking about Luke's father, which would have landed a bit differently, given where the story eventually went. And there's rough footage from the cantina shoot that has floated about in documentaries for years. I should also mention the actors because they've had an odd time of it. Hagen played Biggs, Kustark played Kami, and Fixer was played by a chap called Anthony Forrest, who also, in the same film, put on a stormtrooper helmet and stood in front of Alec Guinness while Guinness waved his hand and told him these weren't the droids he was looking for. So the same man is both a deleted scene and one of the most quoted moments in film history. No notes. That's a brilliant CV. Some wider context makes the whole decision less mysterious, and it's one of the better known stories in film editing. The first assembly of that film was, by most accounts, a disaster. It played long, it played slow, and the people who saw it did not walk out saying they'd witnessed the future. What rescued it was the cutting room, Marcia Lucas, Paul Hirsch and Richard Chew, working through it and pulling the whole shape tighter, and the Tatooine opening was one of the first things to go. You can see why. It's the softest 20 minutes in the picture, and it sits in the worst possible place, right where the film needs to convince an audience that it's about something enormous. So this isn't a case of a scene being disliked, it's a case of a scene being in the way, which is a distinction I keep coming back to tonight, because it applies to most of what we're going to talk about. Fun detail from the technical side, for anyone who likes this sort of thing. In the reconstructions, the Biggs conversation connects to the Tosche Station material with a circular wipe, and then the next segment picks up with the droids ejecting from the Tantive 4. So the two threads were designed to interlock. Pull one out, and the other has to be reblocked, which is part of why the cut was cleaner than it looks. What I keep coming back to, though, is the wormy thing. I'd argue it's the single most useful bit of characterization ever removed from a major film. It costs about 4 seconds. It tells you exactly where this boy sits in his own life. And without it, you have to take the film's word for it that he's restless, rather than watching him be humiliated in front of a girl he fancies, by people who've known him since he was small. I don't think Lucas made the wrong call. I do think it's the wrong call. I'd most like to see undone. Anyway, that's the material cut for pacing. But the biggest thing removed from that film wasn't a character moment at all. It was an entire gangster, and the reason he went is much less about storytelling and much more about money. His name was Declan Mulholland, and he was, by every account, a lovely bloke. Born in Belfast in 1932, a proper working character actor of the sort British and Irish television used to run on, the kind of face you've seen 40 times and never once put a name to. He turned up in the charge of the Light Brigade. He was in the ruling class and Theatre of Blood, and the land that time forgot. He did Doctor Who, he did everything. And in 1976 at Elstree, he was handed a very large shaggy fur coat and told he was going to be Jabba the Hutt. The scene is set in the docking bay at Mos Eisley, just before Han takes off with Luke and Obi-Wan. Jabba is waiting for him by the Falcon with a few heavies. He wants his money. Han does the Han thing, all charm and deflection, promises to pay up as soon as he's been paid for the Alderaan run, and Jabba tells him that if the money doesn't turn up, there'll be a bounty on his head, so large he won't be able to set foot in a civilized system. If that dialogue sounds familiar, that's because you've heard most of it. When the scene came out, the beats were redistributed to Greedo in the cantina, which is why Greedo's little sit-down covers exactly the same ground. Now, the reason it came out is not mysterious, and it isn't really an editing decision at all. Mulholland was never meant to be the finished article. The plan was to shoot him on set as a placeholder, and then replace him in post with a creature, a stop-motion job, in the same family of technique as the holochess table. That plan required time and money that the production simply did not have by the end, so there was no creature. And you cannot release a film in which a mob boss in a fur coat is treated as a terrifying alien crime lord, because the audience will laugh, and they will be right to. So it went in the bin, and it stayed there for 20 years, and it became one of those things people talked about. Fragments turned up in From Star Wars to Jedi in 1983, always as a curiosity, always with a nudge. There's the famous one. There's the man who was almost Jabba. Then 1997 happened. For the 20th anniversary re-release, Lucas went back into the vault and pulled the scene out. And this time, the technology existed. Industrial light and magic dropped a computer-generated Jabba over the top of Mulholland, using the design from Return of the Jedi. Steve Williams, the ILM animator who took the job on, has described the direction he got, and it's my favourite piece of Star Wars production trivia by an absolute mile. The Jedi Jabba was too wide. He physically would not fit into the space where a man had been standing. So the note was, more or less, imagine Jabba's been on a diet. You can still spot the seams if you know where to look. Han walks around behind him and steps up onto his tail, which was originally Harrison Ford walking round a man and stepping past him. They animated the tail to bend under his boots rather than reblock the shot. It's a neat fix, and it's also a complete giveaway. One knock-on effect worth knowing about. When the Jabba scene came out, it took a chunk of information with it. The debt, the threat, the specifics of what Han owes, and to whom. That information was needed, so additional footage was shot for the Greedo confrontation to pick up the dialogue that had been orphaned, which is why that cantina exchange does so much heavy lifting for a scene that's supposed to be a quick bit of menace before a shootout. Greedo is delivering half of somebody else's part, and it kept getting revisited. The 1997 Jabba does not look good. It looked slightly ropey at the time, and it has not improved with age. There's a wobbliness to the way he sits in the frame that gives the whole thing away. So he was replaced again in 2004 with a better model, and adjusted again after that. The scene is now, in a strange way, the most remade 30 seconds in the franchise. A scene that was never released has been re-released 3 or 4 times. Here's the bit I find uncomfortable, and I've gone back and forth on how strongly to say it. Of all the deleted material from that film, this is the one Lucas actively wanted back. Everything else stayed cut. He went out of his way to restore this, and in restoring it, he erased the performance completely. Hagen and Stark and Forrest all eventually got their footage released, cleaned up, put on discs, treated as part of the record. Mulholland's scene has never had a proper official release in its original form. What exists publicly is a few seconds of before and after, deployed to show off the visual effects work that replaced him. The official line has always been that Lucas intended a creature from the start, and Mulholland was only ever a stand-in. That's plausible. It's also the version that happens to be most flattering to the people telling it, and some very sharp researchers have raised an eyebrow at it over the years. The counterpoint being that the scene was shot and edited as a scene, with a performance in it, and the always meant to be replaced framing does a lot of convenient work. I don't know which is true. I don't think anyone outside the room does. But Mulholland died in 1999. 2 years after his one Star Wars appearance was released to the world with him digitally painted out of it. And I do think he's owed a clean copy on a disc somewhere. It's a small ask. The footage exists. Fans being fans have done it themselves. There are restorations floating about online, put together by people doing frame-by-frame work in Photoshop for weeks on end, cleaning up decades-old low-quality sources so that a man in a coat can have his scene back. It's a slightly absurd amount of effort. It's also quite touching, and it's a pattern you'll see again and again tonight. The audience doing preservation work the rights holder didn't fancy doing. Another scene sat right next to that one in the original assembly, and it's rarely talked about. On the Death Star, before the film's back half kicks in, there was more material with Tarkin's officers, including a character called Bast, an aide who warns that the station has a weakness and that they ought to consider evacuating. Tarkin, being Tarkin, dismisses him. That got cut too, and the funny consequence is that Bast survives in the film as a man standing in the background of the briefing room with a name in the credits and nothing to do. He then reappeared of all places in the holiday special, having somehow got off a battle station that exploded. Nobody has ever really explained that, and I've decided not to look into it too hard. One last wrinkle, because it's daft and I enjoy it. There is a genuine attempt in the old expanded material to retcon the fur coat man into existing. Since he can't be Jabba anymore, the 1981 radio drama makes him one of Jabba's henchmen, nicknamed Heater. The 70s comic adaptation used a different alien in the role entirely, and that character later got named as Jabba's accountant. Star Wars has never once been able to leave a loose end alone. Somebody, somewhere, will always write a paragraph to explain it. Now the sequel had a completely different problem. Not budget, and not really pacing either. Monsters. Echo Base was originally overrun. Not by the Empire, before the Empire. In the first draft and in the footage they actually shot, the rebels on Hoth have a Wampa problem, and it is not one Wampa nicking Luke off his Tauntaun. It's a group of them, coming up through the ice, into the corridors, while everyone's trying to pack. The remarkable thing is how much of the setup survives in the released film, if you go looking. It's been quietly defused rather than removed. Someone mentions dead Tauntauns nobody can account for. There's a general air of the base being slightly haunted. Watch it knowing the subplot existed, and it hangs together completely differently. In the deleted footage, the sequence is built like a proper creature feature. R2 gets chased down a corridor by something you don't see. The rebels shoot it, off-screen. A soldier reports to the general that the threat has been dealt with, and then adds, almost as an afterthought, that there may be more of them. Leia asks whether anyone's actually examined the thing, and when they do, she realises it can't be a Wampa, because whatever they shot is metallic. Which of course means it's a probe droid, and the Empire has found them, and the two plots were originally meant to braid together. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the base, 2 of the actual creatures have come through the wall. The rebels fight them off. They lose people. Eventually, they corral the survivors into a single storeroom, shut the door, and put a warning sign on it. Big yellow sign. Do not open. Then everything moves on, and the Empire arrives and the evacuation starts, and then during the retreat, Han and Leia and C-3PO come belting past that door, and 3PO stops. He goes back. He rips the warning sign off the door and toddles away. A few seconds later, a squad of snowtroopers reaches the same corridor, sees an unmarked door, opens it, and one of them is dragged inside by something very large. Vader walks past a moment later, glances at it, and keeps going. Unbothered. Not his problem. I need to be clear that this is the best thing C-3PO has ever done. Across 11 films, that droid has contributed almost nothing but complaining. And in the one deleted sequence where he's allowed to be a bit of a menace, he sets a lethal trap for enemy soldiers and walks off whistling. It's premeditated. He thinks about it. He comes back for it. The film is poorer without it, and I will not be moved on this. My favourite tiny casualty of that whole section, incidentally, is a Treadwell droid, one of the spindly little maintenance units that tries to follow Luke out of the base and simply falls apart on the spot. It has no bearing on anything. It's a 2-second sight gag about a knackered machine giving up, and it's exactly the sort of texture that makes a place feel lived in. Gone, obviously. So why did it go? 2 reasons, and neither of them is precious. The first is that the suits didn't work. The Wampa costumes in that footage look like oversized soft toys. There's a reason the creature in the final film is glimpsed in flashes. In the dark, in snow, the moment you put one in a well-lit corridor for a sustained period, it stops being frightening and starts being a bloke in a rug. Which is the exact same problem the fur coat caused 4 years earlier, and you'd think somebody would have learned, but there we are. The second reason is momentum. The Hoth section of that film is a beautifully engineered collapse. The Empire arrives, the shield goes down, everything falls apart, everyone runs. Sticking a monster subplot in the middle of it splits your attention at the precise moment the film wants you to feel one single thing, which is that these people are losing badly and need to leave. The footage sat unseen for about 3 decades and finally turned up properly on the 2011 Blu-ray set. And in typical fashion, bits of it have been quietly folded back in over the years. The shadows of the Empire game let you run through Echo Base, past the room where they're penned up, and Forces of Destiny, of all things, did a very gentle version, where Leia and R2 go looking for Chewbacca and find him in the grip of an enormous Wampa. So the idea has never quite been allowed to die. It just got tidied up and made suitable for a Tuesday afternoon. The rest of that film's offcuts are a mixed bag. The attack on Luke at the start was longer, with more of the creature. There's an extended version of the Han and Leia argument in the hallway, and it does Han no favours at all. He comes back after the Wookiee kiss line and tells her she's as cold as the planet, and she storms off, and he reads less as a lovable rogue and more as a man being unnecessary. You can see exactly why it went. Then in the medical bay, after Luke comes out of the Bacta tank, Leia looks at his scars, tells him she was worried, brushes his hair back. He starts to say he was worried he'd never see her again. They lean in, and then the droids barge through the door, because the droids always barge through the door. Given what Return of the Jedi does with those 2 characters, this is a slightly awkward artifact. The kiss that's in the film is already a bit much. The deleted version is more of it, and it's slower. I'll say one thing about it and move on. The rest of that scene is actually rather good, because Leia gets properly narked that both of them are leaving her at once, calls the pair of them moon jockeys, and says she'd get more loyalty out of the ice creatures down the hall, which is a decent line, and also a leftover from the subplots we just spent 10 minutes on, because in the version they shot, there really were ice creatures down the hall. A couple of smaller ones worth having. A brief shot of Boba Fett standing in the carbon freezing chamber didn't survive the cut, which is the sort of thing that matters enormously to about 4,000 people and not at all to anyone else. I'm in the 4,000. An extended exchange between Han and Chewie has Han telling him not to lose his temper, which is a nice bit of business and does absolutely nothing for the plot. And General Veer's death was filmed and dropped, which is a genuine loss because, as released, he simply stops being in the film. 1 minute he's the most competent officer in the Empire, running the ground assaults with total professionalism, and the next he's evaporated from the story. Fan restorations have colorized the black and white workprint footage of it, and it's better than not having it. Something else worth saying about this film specifically. It was directed by Irvin Kershner rather than Lucas, and you can feel that in the offcuts. The deleted material from the first film is mostly plot and world building. The deleted material here is mostly people talking to each other in rooms, arguments, apologies, half-finished conversations, which tells you a bit about what each production thought it was making and about which bits each production was willing to lose when the running time came up short of the target. That's the thing I find most interesting about deleted material generally. It doesn't come out cleanly, it leaves fingerprints. Half the odd lines in these films are the residue of something that used to be there. Since we're on the subject of things cut for pace, the third film in that trilogy lost its entire original opening. The very first scene ever filmed for Return of the Jedi was cut from Return of the Jedi. They started shooting on the 11th of January 1982 at Elstree, and the thing they put in front of the camera on day one was a sandstorm sequence that nobody watching the film in cinemas ever saw. I find that quietly funny. Months of prep, a full crew, the first slate of the whole production, and it goes straight in the drawer. We'll get to the storm. First, the opening, because the opening they shot is very different from the one you know. As released, the film starts with a Star Destroyer, then Vader arriving at the second Death Star to lean on Moff Jerjerrod, and then 2 droids walking up to Jabba's palace. Luke doesn't appear for ages, and when he does, he simply walks in, hooded, and starts choking people with his mind. It's a fantastic entrance precisely because you have no idea what he's capable of now. The original version fills all of that in. After the Jerjerrod scene, we'd have cut to Vader in his meditation chamber, a shot actually lifted from The Empire Strikes Back, which is a lovely bit of thrift, reaching out through the Force, calling to Luke, and then Tatooine, a cave, Luke and R2 inside it, and Luke is finishing the green lightsaber, building it, adjusting it, testing it. Then he switches it off and hands it to R2 to look after, which is why the droid has it in his little rocket compartment on the skiff later. Then a longer scene outside the cave with 3PO, who does not know the plan, is not going to be told the plan, and is deeply unhappy about walking into a gangster's fortress with only a bin on wheels for company. He does his "We're doomed" line. It's fine, it's the sort of thing that scene is for. But here's the detail that actually matters, and it's in the background rather than the dialogue. Parked outside that cave, you can see 2 ships, the Millennium Falcon and an X-Wing, which tells you without a single word that this is a coordinated operation. Lando is already inside, Leia is coming, Chewie is coming, everyone has a job. Luke has not turned up on his own to improvise. Cutting that scene changes the rescue from a plan into a magic trick. And I'm going to be unpopular here, because I think that's an improvement. The theatrical opening of Return of the Jedi is one of the best sequences in the trilogy, and a great deal of that is down to how little it explains. You spend 20 minutes watching a rescue attempt fail in stages, and only at the end do you realise that every single failure was part of it. That works because you weren't shown the meeting. Put the meeting back in and you're just waiting for a plan you've already been told about. What you lose is smaller but real. Vader later tells Luke, "I see you have constructed a new lightsaber." And in the theatrical cut, that's a fairly odd thing to say, because we never saw him construct anything. It's a line reaching back for a scene that isn't there. Right, the sandstorm. Han's been thawed, the sail barge is a smoking hole in the ground, and the heroes still have to cross a desert to get to their ships. So they cross it in a storm. Goggles on, wind everywhere, shouting at each other over the noise. Luke tells Han and Leia he isn't coming with them. He's got a promise to keep, he says, to an old friend. That's Yoda, obviously. And that line survived, they just moved it into the cockpit shot instead. So Luke says it to R2 in space, rather than to his friends' faces on the ground. Which is the same information delivered with about a tenth of the weight. Then Han pulls him aside to thank him for coming back for him. And this is the bit that never leaves me once you've heard it. Han talks about the carbonite. He says the carbon freeze was the closest thing to dead there is. And then he clarifies, because he's clearly still turning it over, that it wasn't sleep. It was a big, wide-awake nothing. He was conscious. That is a horrible piece of information, and the film simply doesn't contain it. In the version everyone watched, Han comes out of the block, temporarily blind, has a joke about it, and gets on with the film. In the version they shot, he'd been fully awake inside a slab of metal for the better part of a year, with no eyes, no ears, no movement, and no way to know how long it had been. And nobody thinks to make anything of it afterwards, because that's Han. He mentions it once in a sandstorm, to a lad who's about to fly off, and then never again. The scene went because you can barely hear a word of it. The wind machines won. There's also a Luke and Leia moment in there that, again, plays differently now that we know they're siblings, and I suspect that didn't help its chances either. A documentarian named Jamie Benning eventually reconstructed the whole thing properly, cleaning up the audio so you can actually make out what's being said, which is the only reason most of us know the carbonite line at all. The sequence has a second half as well, where Luke sits and deals with the wound in his mechanical hand. There's a hole blown through it from the fight on the skiff. He pulls the black glove over it. That's where the glove comes from. Small thing, nice thing. The rest of the film's offcuts are odds and ends. Moff Giorgio standing up to Vader rather more than he does in the finished version, which makes him a bit less of a coat rack. An extended Han and Leia raid on the Endor bunker, a Sullustan piloting a B-wing, and a Mon Calamari pilot with a line about fried calamari tonight, which is the sort of joke you delete for everyone's benefit. The Giorgio one deserves a moment actually, because it changes a character rather than a scene. In the film we have Moff Giorgio exists to be leaned on by Vader in the first 5 minutes, and then to stand about on a bridge. Looking worried, he's furniture. In the deleted material, he pushes back, properly pushes back, holds his ground with a man who murders people for less, which makes the second Death Star feel like a place with actual politics in it, rather than a corridor with an emperor at the end. Something interesting happens with the Dagobah line as well, and it's a good example of how these decisions ripple. Luke tells Han and Leia in the storm that he's going to see an old friend. That's cut, but he still has to say it somewhere, or his disappearance in the second act makes no sense. So the line is handed to R2 in the cockpit, a droid who cannot respond and who already knows. A moment written as a goodbye between 3 people becomes a man muttering to himself in a fighter. The information survives intact, and every ounce of the feeling is gone. That's what cutting for pace actually costs, and it's rarely as visible as it is here. The Endor material got trimmed too, though less dramatically. The bunker sequence with Han and Leia ran longer. Some of the Ewok village business went. And there's a running theme in the offcuts of that film where everything human gets shortened and everything with an explosion in it stays, which is not a criticism exactly, because the film works. It's just a very clear picture of what a production values when the clock is against it. And here's a fun detail about the pattern in all 3 of these films. Every major cut we've talked about so far went for the same reason, dressed up in different clothes. The film needed to keep moving. Not one of them was removed because it was bad. That's a very different situation from what happened 20 years later, when the cuts started coming out for reasons that had nothing to do with pace at all. Picture Yoda climbing out of an escape pod into a swamp. That's it. That's the whole scene. Wide view of a green, wet, miserable little planet, the pod half sunk in the muck, and a very small, very old creature stepping out into it and letting out a heavy sigh, because he has just watched everything he built get taken apart in an afternoon, and this bog is where he lives now. It's in the deleted scenes for Revenge of the Sith. It's called Exiled to Dagobah. It is the connective tissue between the two trilogies, and it's not in the film. I've never fully understood that one. The whole point of that film is to close a gap. Every other loose end gets tied off, some of them rather aggressively, and the single cleanest, quietest, most elegant handover in the entire 6-film run, the old master ending up in the swamp, where a boy will find him 20-odd years later, gets left on the disc as a bonus feature. Anyway, let's go back to the start of that trilogy, because there's a lot in these three. The Phantom Menace lost a scene in which Anakin has a punch-up with another child. The other child is a Rodian who accuses him of cheating in the pod race. They go at each other in the dirt, and Qui-Gon has to come and separate them. The Rodian is a young Greedo, which means the boy who becomes Darth Vader and the alien who gets shot in the cantina had a scrap in a car park as children, and one of them shouted something about cheating. It's daft, and it's exactly the sort of thing that trilogy loved doing, and it has since been referenced in enough official reference books that it's effectively real, whether it's on screen or not. Another cut from the same stretch fixes a small oddity in the finished film. Anakin says goodbye to Jira, the old woman from the market, and gives her some of his pod race winnings. She calls him the sweetest person in the galaxy, which is a line that ages appallingly, and I think that's rather the point. Then on the way back, Qui-Gon spots a probe droid tailing them and cuts it in half, and starts hurrying because if there's a droid, there's someone who sent it. Take that out, and what you're left with in the theatrical version is Qui-Gon and Anakin suddenly running for the ship for no stated reason. The explanation is sitting right there in the bin. They also had an extended pod race, which nobody was crying out for, a submarine escape over a waterfall, more Jedi Council debate, and a Coruscant air taxi ride that got dropped from the theatrical release and then quietly put back in every version since. The extended pod race deserves a note purely for the scale of it. The sequence in the film is already long. The version they assembled was substantially longer, with more of lap 2, a fuller starting grid, and considerably more business with the other racers, including a proper subplot for a Doug called Rats Tyrell, whose family are in the crowd watching. He dies in the tunnel. In the film, that's a quick shot and a bit of a laugh. With the family footage in, it's a man's relatives watching him crash. They shot it. They cut it. I suspect they were right too, but it does tell you the sequence was originally designed to be about something rather than just fast. Attack of the Clones has fewer offcuts, but it has the one I'd actually put back. When Anakin and Padme arrive on Naboo, there was originally a sequence where she takes him home. Her actual home. He meets her mother and father. He meets her sister, and her sister's 2 small girls, and they have dinner. And the family talk about Padme in the way families do about the one who left and did well. Anakin sits in it. That's the only time in the entire saga that anyone shows Anakin Skywalker a functioning family. He was raised in slavery, taken away from his mother at 9, and handed to an order of monks who told him attachment was a failure state. And then for one evening, he sits at a table with parents and a sibling and children who are not in danger, and sees what the alternative looks like. Roughly a week before he loses his mother in a Tusken camp and starts down the road that ends on Mustafar. Cut for pace, I understand why. It's a slow scene in a film that already has a slow middle. But of everything we're going through tonight, that's the one I'd most like to see restored, and it isn't close. Which brings us to Revenge of the Sith, and the biggest single removal in the prequel trilogy. An entire subplot about the founding of the rebellion came out of that film. Several scenes of it, shot and finished. It's usually called the delegation of 2000, and the deleted material includes a sequence called Seeds of Rebellion. Here's how it works. A group of senators start meeting privately in Padmé's apartment on Coruscant. Bail Organa is there. Mon Mothma is there. So are senators called Chi Ikwe and Bana Brimu. They're worried that the Chancellor has taken emergency powers for a war that's ending and shows no sign of giving them back, and that he's picking away at the Constitution one clause at a time. So they draft a petition, 2,000 signatures, asking him to stand down the emergency. And they discuss what happens if he says no. Mon Mothma talks about forming something discreet, an alliance within the Senate, and makes the point very firmly that nobody can be told. Padmé wants to bring in a Jedi she trusts, which is Anakin. The others talk her out of it. That's the Rebel Alliance. That's the meeting, and it happens in a flat, over drinks, with C-3PO handing round the glasses. Two things about it are lovely, and one is a bit heartbreaking. The lovely ones first. It puts Padmé at the founding of the organisation that her daughter will end up running, which is a piece of symmetry the finished films never get to have. And the actress playing Mon Mothma in that footage is Genevieve O'Reilly, who was cut out of the film entirely, and then, more than a decade later, got the part back and has since played that character through Rogue One and across all of Andor. Her first performance in the role sat unused on a shelf for years. That's a very unusual second act for a deleted scene. The heartbreaking bit is what the cut does to Padmé. In the released film, she is mostly a woman in a nightdress waiting in a flat for a man who is out committing atrocities. In the version they shot, she's organising a political resistance in that same flat and choosing not to tell her husband about it. And that decision is the reason the two of them stop being able to talk to each other. Lucas cut it because he felt it pulled focus off Anakin's fall. He's entitled to that view. It's his film. But it's the reason a very capable character spends her final acts doing almost nothing. The subplot survives in the novelisation, and it's treated as having happened. The rest of that film's cuts are a strange collection. There are two entirely different filmed deaths for the Jedi Master Shaak Tai, one where Grievous stabs her in the back in front of Obi-Wan and Anakin, and one where Anakin kills her himself after the turn. Neither made it. There's more of the Kashyyyk battle, with Yoda alongside Tarful and Chewbacca. There's more Jedi Council material about whether Palpatine is the Sith Lord they've been hunting, with Yoda holding the line that suspicion isn't proof. The Shaak Tai situation is worth unpacking slightly, because two filmed deaths for the same character is unusual, and it tells you the production couldn't decide what the scene was for. In one version, Grievous stabs her in the back, while Obi-Wan and Anakin watch, which establishes Grievous as an immediate threat and gives the escape sequence some weight. In the other, Anakin kills her during the temple attack, which puts a named face on the massacre, instead of leaving it as anonymous carnage. Those are two very different films. The first is about the villain. The second is about the hero. They shot both and used neither, which means the temple sequence in the released film has no individual death in it at all beyond the children, and that's a very deliberate sort of blankness. Beyond that, more of the escape from Grievous's ship, and a fair amount of extra Kashyyyk footage that got trimmed down to the handful of shots we have, and a quiet moment between Anakin and Obi-Wan after the Coruscant battle, where Obi-Wan tells him plainly that he's proud of him and thinks of him as a brother. That one is, in the released film in spirit, spread across a few lines, but having it as a single scene would have made the Mustafar dialogue land harder. And there's a scene, cut, in which Palpatine walks down a long corridor with Jar Jar Binks and thanks him for putting him in power. I'm going to leave that one sitting there for now, because it comes back later and it deserves its own bit of the evening. But talking about scenes that got removed, there's a whole other category we haven't touched, and it's the strangest one. Scenes that were in the film and then weren't, years after everybody had already seen them. Every cut we've talked about so far happened before anyone bought a ticket. Somebody in a room decided a scene wasn't earning its place, and it came out, and the version that reached the public was the only version the public ever knew. The second category is much rarer, and Star Wars is the biggest example of it in film history. Scenes that were released, watched by tens of millions of people, re-watched on video for the better part of 2 decades, and then removed. The 1997 special editions are where this starts properly. Lucas went back into all 3 films with a substantial budget and a company he'd built specifically to do this sort of work. And the brief, as he described it at the time, was to finish things he'd never been able to afford. Some of that is plainly true. The Jabba insert we talked about earlier is the clearest case, a scene shot in 1976 that finally got the effect it needed. And the Yavin reunion between Luke and Biggs came back in the same pass, which is the closest that whole storyline has ever come to a proper release. But it wasn't only additions, things went the other way too. Mos Eisley got much busier, with new creatures and vehicles filling out streets that had been fairly empty. The Death Star trench got extra shots. Cloud City got windows. The Empire got a whole new sequence of Vader's shuttle docking, which is handsome, and does nothing. Return of the Jedi took the heaviest hand. The celebration music at the end was replaced entirely, and the closing sequence was expanded into a montage of parties across several planets, so that a small ending became a large one. The unmasked man behind Vader's helmet was later changed. The figure standing beside Obi-Wan and Yoda at the end was changed as well. And then there's the cantina, which I'll handle briefly because there are people who have been arguing about this since the Clinton administration, and I'd rather not join them at this hour. The exchange between Han and Greedo was re-edited in 1997, and then re-edited again in 2004, and again in 2011, and again for streaming. Each version adjusts the timing by a few frames or changes a line. The net effect is that I can no longer tell you with confidence which version is the current one, and I don't think that's a failure of attention on my part. That's just where we've ended up. What actually bothers me isn't any individual change. It's the archival situation underneath them. The versions of these films that ran in cinemas in 1977, 1980, and 1983 have never been given a proper high-quality restoration and release. There was a DVD in 2006 that included them as a bonus, sourced from an old Laserdisc transfer, and it looked exactly as good as that sounds. Beyond that, the theatrical cuts are not commercially available in any decent form. What you can buy and what streams is the revised version. The 2006 release is worth describing properly because it's the single most half-hearted piece of film preservation I've ever seen from a company that size. The theatrical cuts were included, but as a bonus disc rather than the main feature. They weren't remastered, they weren't even anamorphic, which in 2006 meant that on a widescreen television, the picture sat in a box in the middle of the screen, at roughly the resolution of a videotape. Some of them still had the old Laserdisc menu artifacts baked in. That was the gesture. Here you are. Here's your original film. We've put it on a disc. Please stop writing to us. Which means the original edit of one of the most watched films ever made is, in practical terms, out of print. Not banned, not suppressed, not the subject of any dramatic decision. Just quietly not on the shelf, for going on 30 years now. I've made my peace with it mostly. I'd rather Lucas be allowed to fiddle with his own film than not. It is, unarguably, his, and I've never had much patience for the idea that an audience owns a thing because they liked it a lot. But the fan argument about which version is better bores me stiff, and the other argument doesn't. Because a film isn't only a product, it's also a record of a night out. The 1977 cut is what people actually queued round the block for, and what actually knocked the industry sideways. And you'd think somebody would want a clean copy of that on a shelf, somewhere, regardless of how the bloke who made it feels about it now. Nobody's asking Lucas to stop. just to leave the old one in the drawer where people can get at it. And this isn't a Star Wars problem particularly, it's just that Star Wars is where you can see it happening at scale. Films get tinkered with all the time. A colour pass here, a music cue swapped there when a licence runs out, a shot quietly replaced for a streaming version. Most of it nobody notices, because most films don't have people watching them frame by frame with a stopwatch. This one does, so this one is where the whole business becomes visible. And here's the thing that makes this belong in a video about deleted scenes at all. For an entire generation, the deleted scenes of Star Wars include material that was in the film for their whole childhood. If you were 9 in 1985, you have memories of shots that a person can no longer legally purchase. You saw a version of that ending, with that music, that no longer exists on any current release. The film in your head and the film on the shelf have drifted apart, and nobody told you it was happening because it happened in a lab rather than an editing room. And so, once again, the audience picked up the shovel. There is an entire subculture built around reconstructing the theatrical cuts, and the effort involved is faintly unhinged in the best possible way. The most famous of these projects spent years assembling a watchable version of the 1977 film by combining every source anyone could find. The old Laserdisc transfer for the shots that only exist there, the modern high-definition release for everything unaltered, and an enormous amount of manual work to hide the joins. Frame by frame, colour matching between sources that were never meant to sit next to each other. Others went further and tracked down actual film prints, surviving 35mm reels from 1977, in whatever condition 4 decades in a cupboard leaves them, scanned at high resolution and then cleaned up shot by shot to remove scratches and colour fading that nobody would ever bother removing commercially, because commercially it is not worth doing. None of this is legal, strictly speaking. All of it is people doing unpaid restoration work on a film they don't own because the people who do own it have chosen not to. I find that quietly extraordinary. It's the same instinct that produced the Mulholland restorations we talked about earlier. The sense that a thing existed, and existing is enough of a reason to keep a copy. A lovely small irony in it as well. All that effort went into restoring one scene with a man in a fur coat, and in doing so, dozens of other frames were quietly retired. The vault gives, and the vault takes. Now let's talk about the modern era. Because the studios changed, and the technology changed, and the whole culture of how these films get made changed, and the deleted scenes started showing up in the marketing before they were deleted. Picture a young woman standing on a metal walkway, high up, in a white Imperial uniform, and a TIE fighter rising into frame in front of her until it fills the screen. She stands her ground. It's the best shot in Rogue One. It's not in Rogue One. Never was. It never was. It has never been in any version of that film. Millions of people can describe it from memory, and it exists only in a trailer. That happens more often than you'd think, but Rogue One is the extreme case. A professional film editor called Vashi Nedomansky went through all the marketing after release and isolated the individual shots that appear in the trailers, the teaser, and the promo reels, and never appear in the finished film. He counted 46. 46. Some of them are small. An angle here, a bit of coverage there. Plenty of them aren't. There's Jyn walking across the beach on Scarif with the Death Star plans, physically, in her hand, which cannot possibly have happened in the film that got released, because in that version, the data never leaves the tower. It gets transmitted. That's the whole tension of the third act. They can't carry it out, so they have to beam it up. So that beach shot isn't a trim. That's the residue of a completely different ending. Cassian fights alongside rebel troops on the sand, which he never does. Krennic's cape gets a hero shot in the aftermath of the battle, and Krennic dies on top of the tower. Vader stands in front of a red screen, and there's a line where Krennic lectures Vader about the power they're dealing with being immeasurable, which is a great line and would have been a very different scene from the one we got. And there's Jin, in an interrogation, being told her list of offences and answering with 2 words about rebelling. That exchange was in the trailers so heavily that it's practically the film's slogan. It's not in it. The cause isn't a mystery. Rogue One went through extensive reshoots. Gareth Edwards stayed on as director, and Tony Gilroy was brought in to write new material and oversee the work. And by most accounts, a substantial chunk of the second half was rebuilt, which is a fairly normal thing to happen to a big film, and in this case, it produced a very good one, so it's hard to be too precious about it. Edwards has talked about it since, and his explanation is refreshingly unglamorous. Refining the third act meant a lot of specific shots and moments simply fell away, and for the walkway shot in particular, he suggested it was more or less a piece of standalone imagery, the sort of thing you grab because it looks tremendous, without a fixed place in the story. So it went into a trailer, because trailers want tremendous images, and then there was nowhere to put it. Fair enough, really. I do find it slightly cheeky that shots from an abandoned version of the ending were still running in television adverts in the weeks before release, by which point everyone involved must have known. But I've never quite worked out whether that's dishonest or just how the sausage gets made when 2 departments are working to different deadlines, and the reshoots weren't only subtraction. The Vader corridor sequence at the end, the one everybody remembers, the red lightsaber in the dark, the rebels being taken apart in a passageway, is widely reported to be a product of that later work rather than the original plan. So the most celebrated 90 seconds in the film exists because the film got taken apart and put back together. That's worth holding on to, because the conversation around reshoots is usually gloomy, and it doesn't have to be. The largest example of this in the modern era isn't Rogue One though, it's Solo. Phil Lord and Chris Miller directed the great majority of that film and were removed with a few weeks of the schedule left. Ron Howard came in, and by the numbers that circulated afterwards, reshot the overwhelming bulk of it. Not adjusted, reshot. Which means there is a nearly complete version of a Star Wars film, a different performance, a different comedic register, a different tone throughout, sitting in an archive somewhere, and essentially nothing of it has ever been seen. That is the single biggest pile of deleted Star Wars footage in existence, and it isn't a scene or a sequence. It's a whole film. We don't have deleted scenes from it. We have a deleted movie and a handful of stills and some very careful interviews given by people who are contractually obliged to be gracious about it. The sequel trilogy has deleted material too. Most of it is thin, small character beats, alternate takes, a few extended conversations. The Force Awakens has a chunk of Han and Leia material that's decent. The Last Jedi has a whole run of them, including a longer version of the caretakers on the island, which is very funny and very much a bonus feature. Nothing in there rewrites anything. A couple are worth a mention if you're the sort of person who watches the extras. I am. There's a longer run with the caretakers on the island in The Last Jedi, the little fish nuns who look after the temple and clearly regard Luke as an ongoing inconvenience. It's very funny, and it belongs exactly where it ended up, which is on a disc. There's a cut sequence where Luke visits a wrecked ship, and the material with Rey goes somewhere slightly different. And there's a whole alternate opening with Leia that's a bit odd. The Force Awakens has Han and Leia material that adds warmth without adding information, and the Rise of Skywalker's deleted material is mostly connective tissue for a film that badly needed it, which is a slightly sad thing to say about a bonus feature. The interesting one from that era isn't a deleted scene at all, it's a deleted film. Colin Trevorrow was hired to direct Episode 9 and worked on it for a long stretch with the writer Derek Connolly. Their version was called Duel of the Fates. He left the project over creative differences. J.J. Abrams came back, and what eventually reached cinemas was The Rise of Skywalker, which is a substantially different story. Then in January 2020, a few weeks after Rise of Skywalker came out, what appeared to be the full Duel of the Fates script turned up online. I want to be careful here, and I'd rather be boring than wrong. That script has never been formally authenticated by Lucasfilm. Nobody official has stood up and confirmed it. What can be said is that it lines up closely with concept art from the abandoned production that leaked separately, and that people who've read both have found them consistent. So it's probably real. Probably is doing some work in that sentence, and I'm leaving it there. In the broad strokes, and I'll stick to the parts that have been reported consistently, there's no Palpatine in it. Rey's parentage goes somewhere very different. Kylo Ren's arc ends differently, with no redemption of the sort the finished film gives him. Rose Tico has a proper storyline, and Finn, who started the trilogy as a stormtrooper, who walked away, ends it leading an uprising of stormtroopers, which is the obvious ending for that character, and the one the released trilogy never got round to. The reaction to the leak was predictably enormous, and there's a whole cottage industry now built on treating it as the great lost masterpiece. I gently push back on that. Nobody has seen it. Scripts are not films. Plenty of brilliant scripts have become mediocre films, and the reverse happens too. Half the internet is treating an unverified PDF as scripture, and I'd rather not join in. What I do find affecting is John Boyega's response. He played Finn, he'd met with Trevorrow to talk through where the character was going, and he was properly enthusiastic about that version. And when the script leaked, he said publicly that he wasn't going to read it. He didn't want to know. He said he'd be heartbroken, which is, I think, the most human thing anyone has said about a deleted anything. Somewhere out there is the version of your work you don't get to have, and the choice to simply not look at it is a perfectly reasonable one. Right, that's the cutting room floor covered. Which brings us over to the other half of tonight, and to a Gungan. It started as a joke, which is the correct place for it to have started. In 2010, Robot Chicken did one of their Star Wars specials, a sketch show animated with toys, entirely built on taking the mickey. And in it, Jar Jar Binks pulls back the curtain and reveals that he's been a Sith Lord the whole time, that the clumsiness was an act, and that handing the Chancellor emergency powers was the plan. It's a 2-minute gag. That's all it was meant to be. And then people started doing homework. 5 years later, in October 2015, a Reddit user going by Lumpawaru wrote it up properly. And I mean properly. It's a long post, it's structured. It has evidence sections. It reads like someone who has thought about this in the shower more than once, which is the highest form of internet writing. The core of it is this: Jar Jar's physical comedy is not comedy. Watch the sequences where he stumbles through a battle and survives. He ducks at exactly the right moment. He trips into exactly the right place. His hands are always doing something, just before something happens. The argument is that this is a force-assisted version of drunken boxing. Zui Quan, a real martial style built on looking uncoordinated so your opponent misreads what you're doing. If you accept that framing, the clumsiness stops being incompetence and becomes camouflage. Then it builds outward. The Gungan hand gestures resemble force manipulation if you squint. Jar Jar survives things nobody survives. He appears at the exact moments the plot needs a nudge. And, this is the strong part, he is personally, directly responsible for handing Palpatine the emergency powers that end the Republic. He stands up in the Senate and proposes it. A galaxy falls because a comedy character opened his mouth. A companion piece to the argument gets less attention and is, I think, the cleverest part of it. There's a long-running reading of the prequels called the Ring Theory, which holds that Lucas built the 6 films as a set of deliberate structural echoes, scenes and characters rhyming across the trilogies in reverse. Under that reading, Jar Jar sits in the same structural position as Yoda. Both are small, both speak oddly, both are dismissed as ridiculous when introduced, and both are underestimated by everybody in the room. The theory's supporters take that and run. If Yoda is the light side version of that shape, then the mirror is a dark master pretending to be a fool, which is a beautiful piece of pattern matching and, I'd argue, proves nothing whatsoever. But it's the reason the theory has legs beyond the memes. It isn't only, wouldn't it be funny if, it's grafted onto an existing structural reading that plenty of people already found persuasive. Lucasfilm, to their credit, have never pretended it doesn't exist. It got a proper nod in one of the LEGO Star Wars specials, which is exactly the right venue for it, an official acknowledgement with the tone dialed to, "We know, we've seen it, very good." The post landed at exactly the right moment. The Force Awakens was weeks away, nobody knew who Snoke was, and the fandom desperately wanted him to be somebody. So the theory arrived, got welded onto Snoke speculation, and went everywhere. The Snoke business is worth a paragraph on its own, because it's a good example of how theories mutate. Once the idea was loose, it didn't stay put. Within weeks, people had welded it onto the sequel trilogy. Snoke was Jar Jar, or Jar Jar had trained Snoke, or Jar Jar was some returned form of Darth Plagueis, which was itself a theory that had been floating about since the opera scene aired. The rule of two makes all of this fairly difficult, since the Sith are supposed to run on a strict head count of one master and one apprentice at a time, but nobody was letting that get in the way. None of it happened. Snoke turned out to be exactly what he appeared to be, and then rather less than that. But for about 18 months, a serious chunk of the internet was operating on the assumption that the villain of a billion-dollar trilogy might be a Gungan. And I think that's a lovely thing for a fandom to have done to itself. Now the actor, Ahmed Best, played Jar Jar, and he's addressed the theory a few times. And his comments are the reason it refuses to die. He said it feels good when hidden meaning in the work gets noticed. He said there's a lot about it that's true. He's also said in the same conversations that after the backlash, Lucasfilm pulled right back from the character, and that Lucas's own take was much simpler. Jar Jar became a politician. That's it. Not a Sith, a politician. Best also confirmed that the corridor scene we mentioned earlier was real, the one where Palpatine thanks him. And he's noted fairly that if that scene had stayed in the film, it would have given the theory a lot more to work with. I read all of that as an actor, enjoying a good bit rather than confirming anything. It's warm, it's playful, it's slightly enigmatic, and it costs him nothing. Good work if you can get it. Liam Neeson also got asked at a convention in 2017 and said Jar Jar went to the dark side, and that's a man having fun with a crowd. Fair play to him. So where does that leave the theory? Not canon. Never has been. And I don't buy it, and I'll tell you exactly where it falls over for me. The drunken boxing reading requires you to look at some very sloppy 1999 motion capture and decide that every frame is intentional. If you apply that standard to any film ever made, you can prove anything you like. Half of cinema is people standing in the wrong place, because the mark was in the wrong place. But here's the thing. The theory doesn't actually need the drunken boxing. The strongest evidence for Darth Jar Jar isn't hidden at all. It's the plainest fact in the trilogy. The person who delivers the Republic to a Sith Lord on a plate in front of everybody is Jar Jar Binks. That happens on screen, no interpretation required. Whether he meant it is the only question, and the film's answer, that he was manipulated because he was easy to manipulate, is arguably grimmer than the theory, because it means the galaxy fell to a man who correctly identified the most trusting person in the room. What I find most interesting is what the theory is doing socially rather than textually. Jar Jar was for about 15 years the most mocked character in modern film, and the mockery didn't stay on the character. Ahmed Best took an extraordinary amount of abuse for a performance he didn't write, in a story he had no control over, and a fair amount of that abuse was flatly racist. He's spoken about it since, and it's plainly the worst period of his life. He's talked about being frozen out of the industry afterwards, at 26, having done the first major motion capture performance in a live-action film, before Gollum, before any of it. He was doing something nobody had done, and it ended his career for a decade. He's back now. He turned up in The Mandalorian as a Jedi called Kelleran Beck, and the reception was overwhelmingly warm, which was nice to see. And the Darth Jar Jar theory, for all that it's nonsense, is part of how the culture around that character turned. It's a way of going back and deciding the most humiliated figure in the saga was secretly the most dangerous one in the room. It's a bit of dignity applied retroactively by the same audience that took it away. That's not why it's true. It isn't true. But I think it's why it stuck. Since we're on theories that started with one person doing an unreasonable amount of homework, the next one started with an actual astrophysicist, and it has sums in it. On the 9th of August 1997, a man called Curtis Saxton published a document on a fan website. Saxton is an astrophysicist. The site was called Star Wars Technical Commentaries, and it lived on theforce.net, which in 1997 was roughly the centre of the online Star Wars world. The document ran to about 10,000 words, and it was titled Endor Holocaust. The argument is short enough to state in a sentence, and then unpleasant enough to sit with for an hour. It goes like this: the destruction of the second Death Star kills everyone on the forest moon. Everyone. The rebels on the ground, the Ewoks, the whole biosphere, within hours of the party starting. Here's how he gets there. He works out from the on-screen shots and the film's own blueprints that the second Death Star is roughly 900 kilometers across. He then works out its orbit, how far above the moon it must be sitting for the shuttle approaches, and the shots from the surface to make any sense, and lands at somewhere in the region of 2,000 kilometers, which, for an object that size, is not orbit in any comfortable sense, it's hovering. Then it explodes. Saxton runs two cases. If the explosion is soft, the debris doesn't have enough velocity to escape, so nearly all of it simply falls, and the free fall time to the surface is a matter of minutes. If the explosion is hard, the fragments fly off in straight lines, and the fraction pointed at the moon is set by how much of the sky the moon takes up from up there, which he puts at over 15%. Either way, an enormous amount of mass ends up on the ground. His estimate is at least 30 solid chunks, each of them kilometers wide, arriving at 80 kilometers per second or more, within about half a minute of the blast. That's dinosaur numbers. That's the asteroid. 30 of them at once, on a moon. Not ideal. And then the second order effects. Dust and vapour thrown into the atmosphere. Sunlight blocked, temperatures collapsing. A nuclear winter, essentially, on a world whose entire ecology is trees. He also addresses the obvious objection, which is that the rebel fleet is right there and could presumably do something. His answer is arithmetic rather than opinion. You could tractor a certain amount of debris away from one specific area. He suggests you might protect a patch about the size of Luxembourg, but the total mass of the wreckage is vastly greater than the mass of both fleets combined. There is no version of that afternoon where a few dozen ships redirect a moon-sized object's remains. So the last shot of the original trilogy, everyone dancing, is happening under a sky that is about to arrive. There is one piece of on-screen evidence that keeps this alive no matter how many rebuttals get written, and it's very simple. Watch the explosion from the surface. Watch what happens in the frame afterwards. There is visible material coming out of that blast and heading downward, toward the camera, toward the moon. It's brief, and it's easy to miss, and once you've been told about it, you cannot unsee it. The film itself shows you debris on its way. It's also worth remembering where this was published, because the venue is part of the story. 1997 was the peak of a very particular kind of internet. Fan sites hand-built by enthusiasts, hosting long technical documents by people with actual credentials, written for an audience of a few thousand who took the material completely seriously. The technical commentaries were part of a whole genre of that. Fans doing engineering analysis of fictional hardware, working out hull thicknesses and power outputs and orbital mechanics from screen grabs. It sounds like a joke, and it wasn't. Some of that work fed directly into the reference books the company later published. So when a document from that world concluded that the ending of Return of the Jedi was a mass casualty event, it didn't arrive as a wind-up. It arrived with the same tone as everything else on the site, which is exactly why it stuck. I want to be fair to this because it's the only theory in the whole franchise that turns up with working shown, and there's something admirable in that. It's not vibes, it's not squinting at hand gestures. Somebody sat down and did the sums, and the sums are not obviously daft. They are, however, contested heavily. In 2004, a writer called Gary Sarley published a long point-by-point rebuttal, and his approach is the correct one, which is to go after the inputs rather than the conclusions. His argument is that the two numbers everything hangs on, the size of the station and how high it's sitting, are both estimates pulled from film shots that were never designed to be measured. Adjust the size down, adjust the orbit up, and the amount of material reaching the surface drops dramatically. Change how the explosion behaves, and it drops again. Get either of those wrong, and the whole extinction event evaporates. Which is the honest state of it. Both men are doing physics on a special effects shot. The special effects shot was made by people trying to produce a satisfying bang, not a consistent one. Officially, meanwhile, it simply didn't happen. Star Wars Insider addressed it directly and said the Ewoks were fine. Various published stories have reframed the disaster as Imperial propaganda, the kind of thing an Imperial veteran tells people in a bar afterwards. That billions of tons of metal came down on that moon because it makes the loss sting less. Other material has a large portion of the wreckage disappearing through a briefly open hyperspace wormhole when the station's hyperdrive regulator went, which is exactly the sort of solution you invent when you need one. And there's a comic set a week after the battle where a rebel pilot puts out a fire in an Ewok village started by falling debris, which is about as much acknowledgement as the idea has ever received in an official story. Some fires, not an apocalypse. I rather like the propaganda solution, as fixes go. It doesn't deny that people believed it, it just relocates the belief. In that version, the story circulating afterwards, that the moon was scoured, that billions of tons of metal came down on it, is something Imperial survivors told each other and told anyone who'd listen, because if the rebels won by burning down a forest full of small furry people, then the rebels aren't heroes, they're arsonists who got lucky. Which is a very plausible thing for a defeated army to say, and it means the theory can be true as a rumour inside the story while being false as an event. That's a neat piece of writing. It gives the fans their catastrophe and keeps the ending intact, and it costs nothing. And then decades later, the rise of Skywalker put the wreckage of the throne room on Kef Bir, Endor's ocean moon, which has, according to the accompanying reference book, no sentient life on it at all. That's convenient. That's so convenient that I refuse to believe it's an accident. Somebody in a story meeting knew about this theory and found somewhere for the debris to land where nobody would have to answer for it. What I love about the Endor Holocaust, and I do love it, is that it is the only genocide in this entire franchise that was invented by the audience. The films give you plenty. A planet is destroyed in the first 20 minutes of the first one. An order of monks is wiped out in an afternoon. There is no shortage of horror already on the shelf. And yet the one people keep coming back to is the one that isn't there. An atrocity produced by a man with a calculator, working backwards from a happy ending and concluding that the happy ending was a fireball on a delay. That's a very particular kind of devotion. It takes a great deal of affection for something to spend 10,000 words proving it's worse than it looks. Now, that one has an official answer, even if the math still bothers people. the next one doesn't. The cause of death is given by a droid in one line, and it satisfies nobody. Medically, it says, she is completely healthy. For reasons it cannot explain, she has lost the will to live. That's it. That's the official explanation for how Padme Amidala dies at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Lucas has expanded on it a little over the years, and the expansion is more or less that she dies of a broken heart, which is a real documented thing that happens to real people, and which is also a very strange fate to hand a woman who has spent 3 films being the most stubborn person in every room she enters. That's the crux of the objection. Not that it's impossible, that it doesn't fit her. This is a character who ran a planetary blockade at 14, who kept working through an assassination campaign, who was organising a political resistance in her own flat weeks earlier. And the film asks us to accept that she gives up while 2 newborns are being handed to her. It doesn't play. It has never played. And into that gap, inevitably, went theories. The most popular one puts it on Palpatine. The framework is sitting right there in the film. In the Opera House, Palpatine tells Anakin about Darth Plagueis, a Sith who could influence midi-chlorians to create life, and who could keep the people he cared about from dying. It's the speech that turns Anakin, because Anakin has been having visions of Padme dying in childbirth and is now being told that death is negotiable. The theory says Palpatine used it, not to save her, to move her. He takes her life and puts it into Anakin, who at that moment is a burnt torso on an operating table and should not be surviving what he's surviving. And the fans who argue this point at the editing, because the film cuts between the 2 medical rooms, her fading, and the suit closing around him, as though one is feeding the other. People bring up a further detail as well, which is that Pablo Hidalgo, who worked in the Lucasfilm story group, once mentioned that the heartbeats across those 2 scenes were carefully sound designed. That got taken as a nod. It might have been. It might also have been a man saying that the sound department did a nice job. The supporting circumstantial stuff is decent if you want it. Palpatine can clearly sense Anakin's state from a considerable distance. He knows to send a ship to Mustafar. He seems aware of things happening to people he isn't near. And then there's the motive, which is the cleanest part of the whole argument. Palpatine's entire project with Anakin is isolation. Take away the Jedi, take away the mother, take away the wife, and be the only voice left. Killing her does that. Telling him he did it himself does it twice over, because now the man can never go home, even in his imagination. The second version is worse in the good way. It's Anakin, not deliberately. He's a man of enormous, badly regulated power who has spent the entire film obsessing over keeping her alive, and in the moment he's dying, he pulls what he needs out of the person he's connected to. He never knows. It never happens again, because he never tries. That reading got a retroactive boost from The Rise of Skywalker, where life force visibly moves between 2 people through a force connection, on screen, as a thing that is simply possible. Once the films have shown you that, the mechanism stops being invented, and there's a third version, quieter than the other 2, which is that Padme does it. That she's aware, at some level, of what's being taken, and lets it go. That the choice is hers. I have argued for the Palpatine version at parties, so I should be upfront about that. But I don't think any of them are true, and here are the honest objections. None of it is canon, not a word of it. The films have never gone near it. The Plagueis story is Palpatine's own telling, delivered to a desperate man he's actively grooming. He has every reason to be lying about what's possible. Everything built on top of that speech is built on the testimony of the least reliable narrator in the saga, and the practical objection, which I think is the strongest. If a Sith can drain a stranger's life across a planet, at will, without touching them or seeing them, then the Clone Wars are the most pointless conflict in fiction. Why would anyone bother with armies? Why would Palpatine ever have needed a plan? The power has to be either much harder or much more limited than the theory needs it to be. There are two more objections that get raised in these arguments, and both are decent. The first is Shmi. Anakin's mother dies in his arms in the previous film, and he is at least as connected to her, and nothing like this happens. If the mechanism is a bond between two people under extreme emotional pressure, it should have fired then. It didn't, which suggests either that the mechanism doesn't exist, or that it needs something specific that only the Mustafar situation supplied. The second is the children, and this is the one that I think does the most damage. If life force is being pulled out of Padme at that exact moment, why are the twins untouched? They are physically connected to her. They are, by any reading, the most force-sensitive things in the room, and they come out perfectly healthy and go on to be the two most important people in the galaxy. Any version of the theory has to explain why the drain reached her and stopped at them, and none of them really do. One companion theory in the same neighbourhood is worth a brief mention, because the opera scene basically dares you to have it. Anakin has no father. Shmi says as much, and Palpatine in that same conversation describes a Sith who could use the Force to create life. He then adds that Plagueis taught his apprentice everything he knew before the apprentice killed him in his sleep. You are not required to draw a line between those two facts. The scene is quite clearly hoping you will. Lucas has never confirmed it, and the films never state it, so it lives in the same place as everything else tonight. Strongly implied, never said, permanently arguable. One more detail from the film gets rarely brought up by the theorists, and I think it's the strangest thing in the sequence. At the funeral on Naboo, she is visibly still pregnant. That's a deliberate choice. The children have been born and hidden, and the galaxy is being shown a body that says otherwise, so that nobody goes looking. Somebody arranged that. Somebody thought about it, decided it was necessary, and did it. Grim work, which means the last image anyone has of Padme Amidala is a lie told to protect two babies she never got to keep. Whatever killed her, that's the part that stays with me, that the covering up starts before she's in the ground, and that it works, and that it holds for 19 years. Which brings me to why I've come round on the whole business. I used to find the vagueness annoying. I now think it might be the point. Anakin spends that film destroying everything he has in order to prevent one death he has seen in a vision. And the film's answer to how she actually dies is that nobody knows. Not the droids, not the medics, not him. The one question he burned a galaxy to answer comes back blank. That's a better ending than an explanation would be. I still resent it slightly, but it's better. One more before we wrap up, and it's my favourite, because it's the only theory tonight where the evidence is just a droid standing quietly in the corner of the room. At the end of Revenge of the Sith, with everything in ruins, Bail Organa gives an instruction about the two droids. Have the protocol droid's mind wiped. The protocol droid, singular. C-3PO gets cleaned out and starts again as a nervous stranger. Nobody wipes R2. They never do. Never. It's not an oversight either. The Clone Wars establishes that Anakin flatly refused to have it done, which is presented as an eccentricity and a security risk, and which turns out to be the most consequential decision anybody makes about a piece of equipment in the entire saga. So do the accounting on what that little droid is carrying by the time we meet him in the desert. He was on Naboo. He was at the wedding. He's one of two witnesses to a marriage that officially never happened. He was on Geonosis. He went through the entire Clone Wars strapped into the back of Anakin Skywalker's fighter. He was on Mustafar. He watched Obi-Wan and Anakin try to kill each other, and he watched what was left get carried onto a ship. He was in the room when the twins were born, and he saw them separated. He knows all of it. Every single thing that the original trilogy treats as a mystery, R2-D2 was physically present for. Which brings us to the hut. Luke and Obi-Wan are sitting in that hut on Tatooine, and Obi-Wan looks at the droid and says he doesn't seem to recall ever owning a droid. R2 is right there, standing in the room, saying nothing. Then, minutes later, Obi-Wan tells Luke that his father was a navigator on a spice freighter, and that Darth Vader betrayed and murdered him. And R2, who was in the fighter, and on the volcano, and in the delivery room, still says nothing. Not a beep. The theory is very simple, and I think it's the best one in the whole fandom. R2 knows exactly what's happening. He knows Obi-Wan is lying about the droid, because he was Obi-Wan's astromech for years. He knows Obi-Wan is lying about Vader, because he watched it happen. And he chooses, in that hut, to let the lie stand, because he can see what the old man is doing, and he agrees with it. That's the whole thing. It takes what is otherwise a fairly glaring inconsistency between two trilogies and converts it into a character decision, made silently by a machine that can't speak and therefore can't be asked to explain himself, which is why it's endured. Most theories add complication. This one removes it. The wipe is doing more work in this than people usually give it credit for as well. Think about why Bale specifies the protocol droid. C-3PO is fluent in millions of forms of communication and constitutionally incapable of keeping his mouth shut. He is the single biggest security risk in that hangar. He would tell somebody within a fortnight, not from malice, but because he cannot help himself, so he gets cleaned out, which leaves the only surviving witness as the one who physically cannot testify. R2 can whistle. He can beep. He can be understood by people who know how to read a diagnostic screen, and largely ignored by everyone else. The Empire's greatest secret survives, partly because the one entity that knows it communicates in a dialect most people can't be bothered to learn. And a line in the third film fits this so neatly, it's almost annoying. Obi-Wan, confronted about the lie, says that what he told Luke was true from a certain point of view. It's a slippery bit of business, and it's usually read as a Jedi being evasive about a difficult subject. Read it with the droid in the room, and it becomes something else. It becomes a man defending a decision to somebody who was there. There is exactly one other witness to that conversation in the hut, and it isn't Luke. The bigger version is the one I think about most. Lucas has talked more than once, and going back a very long way, about imagining that the whole saga is being recounted long after the fact. A story recorded and told by R2-D2 to somebody at some point, centuries later. It's tangled up with a very old idea that hovered around the project from the earliest drafts, the Journal of the Wills, a sort of framing device where these events are being read out of an ancient text. It's never been abandoned and never been formalised. It surfaces in a line here and a dedication there, and then goes back under. But take the R2 version seriously for a minute, and it does something quite lovely to the films. He's not a supporting character. He's the narrator. Every scene you've watched is his account of what happened, given from memory, a long time afterwards, which explains, cheekily, why he's the most competent individual in every single situation he's ever been in. Why he always has the right tool. Why he happens to be in the right corridor. Why the humans are constantly getting captured, dropping things, and needing rescuing, while the small dustbin quietly solves the problem in the background. That's just how he remembers it. No notes. The theory has picked up complications over the years. Mind, because everything does once a franchise starts making television. Various later shows have put Obi-Wan and those droids in the same rooms again during the exile years, which muddies the hut scene a bit. If he's seen them more recently than we thought, the lie gets harder to read as a careful decision and starts looking more like an inconsistency after all. There's also a decent counter-argument that R2 can't be certain Vader and Anakin are the same person, since nobody sits him down and explains the name change. I don't find that one persuasive. He was on the volcano. He watched Obi-Wan leave a man burning, and he watched the Emperor come and collect what was left. If a droid with a full memory bank and 20 years to think about it can't join those dots, he isn't much of a droid, and he is very clearly an excellent droid. None of this is canon. It's never been stated on screen, and it never will be. And I'm faintly glad about that, because the moment somebody makes it official, they'll have to make a series about it. But it costs nothing to believe, and it's the one theory tonight that actually changes how a rewatch feels rather than just what it means. You watch the hut scene differently once you've got it in your head. You notice that the droid's silences are the only silences in that film that nobody comments on. That's where I'll leave it. Nearly 50 years of a story that keeps getting reopened. Scenes cut for pace, scenes cut for money, scenes cut because the monster suits let everyone down, and a handful of scenes removed from films that had already been out for 20 years. And running alongside all of it, an audience quietly filling in the gaps with everything from careful astrophysics to a Gungan drunken boxing champion. I don't think the gaps are a flaw. I think they're most of why people are still here. A finished, sealed, tidy version of this thing would have been forgotten decades ago. What we've got instead is a film series with holes in it, and 40-odd years of people leaning in to look. Plenty more where this came from. The holiday special, the abandoned early drafts, which are properly strange. The whole enormous expanded universe that got politely set aside. That's all for another night. Thanks for keeping me company.